I was given the brief, it was, and I will now blame Catherine for this one, the original brief was, what really works to realise powers and increase impact whilst within democratic systems. Well, that's what the whole conference is about. It's probably 8 PhDs worth of work. So what I'm actually going to focus on is not the powers so much, but is the powers. But it is very much what's come up, I think, through the last presentations, which is just the democratic legitimacy of independent or relatively independent institutions. And there are several reasons for this. Particularly, I think, in the discussions over the Welsh Bill, this issue came up quite a lot, and not just in relation to the office, but also in relation to implementation. So that would be the public service boards at the local level. Are they independent institutions? Interesting question. But again, the nature of how that fits within the democratic system became something that was interesting to look at. And it was also very much a point of contention last year in Hungary, when many of the institutions here gathered together, and I would say Paula was, let's say, perhaps on one side arguing for those institutions made up and very much embedded, I'm moving slightly on, and then those more independent, and I'll come to that. Also, the Foundation for Democracy and Sustainable Development has been looking at these issues over the years. We've been a bit quiet recently, but are going to come back and relaunch this year. But Graham, can you just stand up? Graham Smith over there has just written a paper, particularly on democratic legitimacy, so you can get him later and I'll circulate it. I did this diagram just to give an overview, because I was trying to get my head around all of the different dimensions that we're talking about. And whilst we're talking about short and long term, which we all know about, some of these other ones are very, very relevant to what institutions are trying to do and to get over. Policy silos and integrated policy. As an ex-policy wonk, it goes on, but it's absolutely critical, and tomorrow I think we're going to hear about that. The third point, principles guide activities in existing liberal democracies, but with a sustainable development we need goals and targets. There are tensions there. Political parties set out their own goals. So that's another tension. Individual freedom is very much, particularly in Britain, part of what democracy is about. We've heard it before. We're talking about collective ethics and a future orientation. That's something a bit different. Edith mentioned it. Environmental limits to human activity, not something necessarily part of democratic systems, although the Climate Change Act in the UK, you could argue in some ways, was one of the first to do that, although interestingly, at the time, we had a very, very centralised government, but arguably, the NGOs then did have a lot of power. Interesting dynamic. At the bottom, again, legally defined citizens involved in decision-making, in politics, affected people, include future generations, etc. That's what the institutions are looking to do. The point about defined political geographies, though, is interesting, isn't covered by institutions. Lots of the issues we're talking about cross political boundaries. So it's not just about national, international, local. It's also, if you're thinking about, let's say, water or marine, crossing those political boundaries, how, where and what do we do? And it's back to governance. How does democracy fit to that? Are we looking at something now which starts to really break that open? Paul has already looked at the different types of institutional types and powers. But one of the key things to point out is that there are those which are relatively independent, lots of them are here today, and two are embedded within government. Very much creatures of parliament, MPs are members. Committee for the Future in Finland is one, and also Valerie Wilms from Germany, in the Parliamentary Advisory Council. And it's interesting, they're slightly different approaches, but the kinds of things that we're talking about, the arguments of independence, I would actually argue some of the things that's happening in Germany are quite strong. For example, the sustainability impact assessment on legislation is something that one would want to see across independent institutions as well. And I think when you look at it, really, we're not talking about one or the other. The two reinforce, so there's something quite strong about that. If you look at the kind of different powers that the different institutions have, there are about 5: investigative, advisory, proactive, legal challenge, and also strategic research and vision. The two which become, I think, quite difficult for democracies are the investigative and the legal challenge. So with investigative, we're talking about reviews and monitoring. There may be demands for information. It was raised before by Marcel, that can sometimes be difficult. There's also audit, and there is investigation of individual and group complaints. Within legal challenge, you also have legal review, and although this hasn't happened now, there has been the ability to veto legislation going through, which has proved problematic for future generations, etc. And it is kind of, in a couple of circumstances, the more challenging an institution has got, the more that's actually created potentially problems for democracies, and they have sometimes been reined back. And that might be something that will come up over the next day or two. What creates power and impact? This was from the original reading of the brief. But if you actually look at this, this comes from bringing together the work that's been done by Oxford Martin, by FDSD, by World Future Council. And through that, you can tell that a lot of the points relate to democracy. It has to be democratically legitimate. And I'll just point to the bottom one, cross-party support. What happens in the UK, I don't know if anyone can actually remember this, before the election really hit off, there was a huge amount of discussion by, well not a huge, but there was a statement made by all the parties together. We all agree that things have to be done on climate change, cross-party support. There hasn't been anything said through the recent time, and there's been a lot of lambasting of the parties for not doing that. But the original, I think, impetus behind wanting to use that as a cross-party statement was quite positive. But it's interesting, as soon as then it gets becomes that party political situation, then it becomes business as usual, more adversarial. Why aren't you saying something? So it's a challenge even to do this within the systems that we've got and our expectations of what one might do. But one thing which is important, and I think people forget, is that in all of this you have to take actually quite a wide view of democracy. It isn't all about representations and party. An independent institution can be seen as a legitimate part of democracy. Like human rights, like the Office of Budget Responsibility that we have in the UK now, it's a check and balance on majority power and short-term political pressures. And I think sort of less is made of that argument in some of the discussions that have been had. Obviously also it's about decreasing democratic deficits for those who are unrepresentative, catalysts for long-term thinking. This need for democratic legitimacy, though, has come up within all the presentations. But those words, open, transparent, participatory, accountable, they're easy words, but I think as Marcel pointed out, sometimes they can be, in practice, tough to actually operationalise. But if you actually look, in a way, at where we are now as a society, democracy as it stands in our political systems are really being flawed from all sides. Particularly, I think, with the Wales We Want consultation, which was something which really did seem to engage a lot of people. It seems like a move towards really opening up the ways in which things are done. But it isn't just about the stakes of the individual. And if you take, for example, let's say a move to a circular economy, on which there's starting to be a lot of discussion. In order for that to happen, it's not just about data gaps that we don't have. It's probably about some extremely strong multi-stakeholder partnerships across sectors which are starting to look at and work together. So within that you start to think, well, here potentially is another role for actually looking at how this is going to work legitimately, and also, and I think something that hasn't been said and is very important in this, democracy isn't fluffy, it's hard. It's about contest, it's about dispute, and the role perhaps of independence in mediating between that becomes quite important as well. I just want to end on a point about participation. It's a slightly different one from what Marcel was saying, but of course it's very critical to the idea of democratic legitimacy. We know that participation is important for a whole set of reasons, whether it's trust, acceptance, improving knowledge, legitimacy. Like I said, conflict and difference resolution is important. But I think there are a couple of things that are worth bearing in mind when looking forward for how to really make a lot of the things we're doing work. Deliberative participation, we do know from evidence that people can manage complex decisions. Lots of people involved as experts or civil servants struggle, I think, sometimes with that and how best to make it work. But we know when it's done well, it can happen, and it is good. And when we're talking about, again, the circular economy, this is tough, but it will only be when all the players in the room, all people affected, get together. There is evidence also that when you have longer term participation, not just that quick voting, that people's values tend to shift more towards other regarding and longer term perspectives. And that's very much about face-to-face. It doesn't really happen with the e-democracy approach. I don't know if you've been involved in those, but it is interesting how you take into account what people are saying. It modifies what you yourself think. And here's the but, because there's lots and lots of talk about this. There are lots and lots of ways of doing it. But, and again, I actually have to acknowledge Graham for looking at this for UNICEF, that a lot of this has been done on single issues, hasn't really been tested within the very broad-based strategy, although I think within Wales you've really done something which has started to do that. Not well integrated into policy processes, again, ongoing. It's also been used very little within scrutiny and monitoring. There are examples in Brazil where it has, but thinking about within the scrutiny and monitoring process, how can participation better enable that? And finally, as I wanted to kind of include in this, the mediation of conflicts and disputes, that's said quite strongly on purpose, but it's just about difference, how best to mediate difference, how best to make that work. So in this sense, participation might be seen as an either-or to effectiveness, but what the arguments there are saying, well, actually it can improve effectiveness, and how best to do that is not just about a legal right to information, it's about much more than that.
Yes, thank